Hello BookTube and welcome to Weekly Reads. This week I've only managed to finish 2 books and no bells. So the first book I read this week was on Saturday, was Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. This was a buddy read with Deborah Johnson, who's a frequent commenter on my channel. This is the 3rd time I've read Murder at the Vicarage, and I still enjoyed it. It was really good, and I needed some Agatha Christie. So, The Murder at the Vicarage is the first Miss Marple novel. And then I think it was a few years later, the second one came out, and then in the later 40s and 50s, more came out. But anyway, so Murder at the Vicarage is the only novel in this particular anthology. The next 2 are Poirot novels, and then I think the later 2, I think one's a Tommy and Tuppence and the other one's a standalone. But anyway, so about Murder at the Vicarage. It all starts when Mrs. Price Ridley is convinced that a £1 note that she placed in the donation at the during a church service has gone missing. And she takes her concerns to the church warden, Colonel Prothero, who has a meeting with the vicar. The vicar is called away, and when the vicar returns, Colonel Prothero is dead, murdered, obviously, at the vicarage. And unfortunately for Colonel Prothero and the detectives of St. Mary Mead and Much Benham, Colonel Prothero was not a very popular man. Many people had cause to murder him. So the novel is told from the point of view of the vicar, Clement, who inserts himself into the investigation, and then he begins to pass on some of what he's learned to Miss Marple, who generally is how she gains her information. Is she makes friends with either people close to the investigation or the detectives themselves and gleans her information and then arrives at the solution. So, one thing about this novel that really jumped out at me is the inconsistency between the suspects that Miss Marple is pointing to. She says there are 7 people who could have murdered Colonel Prothero. And the suspects that the readers would most likely be looking at as who could be the murderer. And the interesting thing is that 4 of the ones that Miss Marple rules out are given very little development in the way of how they could have done it, or their motive, or anything like that. Even though in hindsight it's a bit obvious. And I also think the subplot with the missing £1 note is a bit underdeveloped. Although I suspect if and it would be interesting to see if Christie ever left any sort of writings about her thought processes about the various novels, or spoke about some of the behind the scenes, how she wrote, and of whether or not the lack of attention paid to the embezzlement at the church, at the vicarage, or at the church, would have indicated that maybe one of them, the vicar himself or his assistant, would have been sort of like the runner-up for being the murderer rather than the actual murderer. Which, another thing I noticed is how Christie sort of plays her trick on the reader, in which it looks like it's a red herring, but then it's a red herring in another direction. And I know I'm probably being very sort of vague with my descriptions, but I'm trying not to spoil the book. My first inclination is to just talk about the book and analyze it and spoil it to hell and back, but I'm probably not many of you, well, I shouldn't say that. I'm not entirely sure how many have actually read Murder at the Vicarage, so whether I could be spoilerific and talk about it and analyze it to my heart's content, or I should really sort of hold back, because in a way, I mean, with detective fiction, that initial read, you really shouldn't be spoiled too much, because I mean, that kind of, it ruins the surprise. Because with detective fiction, particularly what's called now cozy mysteries, of which Agatha Christie is the mistress of, the story is very much a problem, a puzzle. It's a competition between the writer and the reader. The reader's trying to solve the mystery, and the author is trying to hide it, to make it as difficult as possible. So I do quite like sort of the red herring, sort of double red herring, and also the trick at the end. Which, the thing about the Miss Marple novels, more so than most of her other detectives, is Miss Marple never quite has, like, physical evidence to prove her case. It's always incredibly circumstantial, referential, very sort of literary analysis, in a way. And so, in order to prove her case, she basically has to convince the police to trap the criminal, the murderer. And obviously, in trapping them, they're pretty much confessing, or they've got them at least on another, usually murder charge, or attempted murder charge. But anyway, so I really enjoyed this reread of Murder at the Vicarage, and I'm looking forward to reading many of these novels for the first time. Dead Man's Folly, Sad Cypress, Towards Zero, and Interim I've never read, although I have seen the adaptation of Dead Man's Folly, but that was ages ago, with the David Suchet Poirot series, which I think they wrapped up in the early 2010s, I want to say. I could be wrong. And I've seen both television adaptations of Murder at the Vicarage, and obviously the Joan Hickson one is much better. And I'm actually looking forward to tracking them down. So I want to say the more recent one's on Hulu, but I think I'm going to have to do some work to try to get the Joan Hickson ones. But anyway, so really enjoyed that one. I guess I could just go ahead and put it back up, because my Christie's go here. Okay, so the other book I read this month, or this week, and took me far, far longer to read than I thought, because I thought is Revolution in the Air by Max Elbaum. This is a history of the new communist movement. So towards the end of the 60s, 1968, a number of student activists became increasingly radicalized and moved into revolutionary politics, namely Marxism-Leninism, and specifically Maoism. That most of these new communist movements espouse some form of Maoism. So usually it's like Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Until, of course, the Chinese Communist Party turned to Washington and became increasingly capitalist in the later 70s and into the 80s. Anyway, so this was a very fascinating book. At the time it was written, this came out in the early 2000s, although this particular edition came out in 2018. This particular history was little studied compared to the rest of the protest movement in the 60s and 70s. And I really enjoyed it. More, I think, because I'm developing a taste for and an interest in sort of student radicalism and Maoism and sort of left-wing politics, or the history of them at least. I mean, the writing style, it's very dense. It took me 6 days, which is far longer than I thought it would. Largely because the style is what you would expect from an old Marxist. But anyway, but it is very fascinating, and as a history, it's primarily focused on ideas, on the varying permutations of ideology, and how the new communist movement sort of self-destructed in the later 70s and into the 80s. Although, I mean, another way you could think about it, and I think, so I mean, it's a history, but it's also, in a way, a guide for more recent progressives, particularly in like the late 90s, early 2000s when the book was first written, and up to today. The foreword to this edition by Alicia Garza really sort of looked at this book as sort of where, like, let's see if I can phrase this right, sort of what mistakes the new communist movement made, namely becoming too sectarian, becoming too wrapped up in dogmatism, and trying to be pure Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, or moving away from that eventually. But I mean, but not really getting along with other movements whose difference of opinion is iota compared to others. But also what they get right, and where their examples could be useful for newer movements. So it was really fascinating and interesting. And so that leads me to what I will be starting tomorrow. I'm for sure I'm going to be reading over the course of the weekend Republic of Wrath by James A. Marone. This is the history of the United States, basically when we're at each other's throats. and I'm looking forward to it. I read bits of the first chapter before I bought the book through a preview and really liked what I read, so looking forward to getting to this. And from there, my readings during the work week, I'm not entirely sure. I should really be getting to The Swimming Pool Library by Allan Hollinghurst. I've mentioned several times that I want to read all of Hollinghurst's novels over the course of the first 6 months of this year, so I really need to get to it. And I also mentioned that I want to read the whole of the Khorasan archive, starting with the Bloodprint by Ausma Zehanat. But right now, I'm kind of giving the made-up stories the side eye. The Murder at the Vicarage notwithstanding, so far I haven't really had much success with the fiction I've been reading this year. Most of them have ended up being bails. So, I don't know. So if I decide not to read either The Swimming Pool Library or The Bloodprint, I'm going to probably read Ecstatic Nation by Brenda Wineapple. Which I'm looking forward to getting to. And I do also want to, and I'm looking forward to having another go at Iran, A Modern History by Abbas Amanat. I read this for Nonfiction November, and I ended up bailing on it, but I'm going to come back to this. I want to come back to this. I'm excited to come back to this, so I just need to find the time for it. So we'll see what I decide to read after Republic of Wrath. But anyway, BookTube, that's what I've read, what I'm planning on reading, and so preview of what I'm going to do next week. So I'm going to have a book tag. It's going to be the Miss Marple book tag. I'm still working on it. I had an idea. Well, I had two directions I could have gone in. One was to do a bookish tag where the prompts would result in book answers. But I also had the idea of doing a Q&A style where, I mean, the answers would not be books. It would be other things. I'm thinking I'm going to go with the bookish ones. And I've got most of the questions set, but I want to have another go at some of the questions. I'm not entirely pleased with them. So look forward to that on Tuesday, and Monday will be a look at my readings for January of 2018, and Wednesday and Thursday I'm not entirely sure about what I'm going to do, and then of course on Friday will be another weekly reads, and in about 2 weeks there will be a book haul. So I will kind of sort of be wading into the book haul war that's going on in this corner of BookTube. So anyway, BookTube, I'm going to sign up for now because there are a lot of Steve Donahue videos I need to get to, and I want to watch the first 2 episodes of WandaVision. So anyway, BookTube, thank you. Have a great evening. Stay safe, and I will see you next week.